A millionaire laughed when a boy said he could cure his son, but the next day, something miraculous happened. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Richard Wainwright stared helplessly at his son's cardiac monitor, the numbers stubbornly refusing to improve, much like his mood after spending another fortune on a failed experimental treatment. The steady beeping echoed through Tyler's luxurious hospital room, a space that more closely resembled a high-end hotel suite than a medical facility. Expensive medical equipment surrounded the frail 12-year-old boy, whose pale skin seemed almost translucent against the pristine white sheets. "How long has he been like this?" Richard asked, his voice tight with exhaustion. "His vitals have been consistent for the past 48 hours, replied Dr. Montgomery, a silver-haired man whose calm demeanor had once been reassuring, but now felt infuriating. "But consistent doesn't mean improving, I'm afraid." Richard loosened his Italian silk tie and moved closer to his son's bed. Tyler was sleeping, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a moment, Richard was transported back a decade, watching a toddler Tyler running across the lawn of their Hamptons estate while he conducted business calls on the patio. Always watching from a distance, always promising himself he'd make more time once the next deal closed. Now time was the one commodity his billions couldn't buy. "Mr. Wainwright," Dr. Montgomery continued, his voice dropping to that particular tone doctors use when delivering bad news, "I believe we need to discuss options for comfort care at this point." Richard's head snapped up. "Comfort care? That's what you people call giving up, isn't it?" Dr. Montgomery sighed. "After 14 experimental treatments, 3 clinical trials, and consultations with specialists from 4 continents, we must acknowledge that Tyler's condition is progressing despite our best efforts. His rare blood disorder has proven resistant to every protocol we've attempted." "Then find a protocol we haven't attempted," Richard said coldly, straightening his custom gray suit jacket. "I didn't build a real estate empire by accepting failure as an option." As Dr. Montgomery began to explain, again, why the latest treatment had failed, Richard noticed a young black man in a brown custodial uniform quietly entering the room with a cleaning cart. The young man, probably no more than 20, glanced at Tyler's monitors with unusual interest as he emptied the trash cans. Dr. Montgomery lowered his voice. "The latest bone marrow transplant simply didn't take. The rejection was severe, and frankly, another attempt would put Tyler at significant risk. It may be time to focus on quality of life rather than—" "Mr. Wainwright, I know something that might help your son," the young janitor suddenly interjected. The room froze. Dr. Montgomery looked embarrassed, while head nurse Patel made a subtle gesture for the young man to leave. "Excuse me?" Richard turned slowly, his immaculate gray suit contrasting with his flushing face. "My grandmother knows a remedy," the young man continued, looking directly at Tyler with disconcerting conviction. I can heal your son." Richard's laugh started low, almost incredulous, before exploding into a cutting guffaw that filled the room. "You? A janitor? You're going to cure what a Harvard team couldn't?" Richard pointed to Dr. Montgomery's framed diplomas on the wall. "I've spent $20 million on treatments, hired the world's top specialists, and you think your grandma has the answer?" His voice was pure scorn. "Elijah is just trying to help, Mr. Wainwright. He volunteers here." Dr. Montgomery attempted to intervene, noticing the devastated look on the young man's face. "My name is Elijah Johnson, sir. My grandmother was a healer in Louisiana, and—" the young man began to explain. "Out now!" Richard pointed at the door, a vein pulsing in his temple. "I'm paying for science, not voodoo or whatever superstition you're peddling." Elijah backed away, humiliated, while nurses and doctors averted their eyes in embarrassment. As he left, however, he looked once more at Tyler and murmured, "I just wanted to help." After Elijah's departure, Dr. Chen, an oncologist recently consulted, confronted Richard. That janitor, as you called him, has the highest IQ of any volunteer who's ever been through this hospital. He's in the program for gifted youth. I don't care if he's Einstein in disguise. I need real solutions, not fairy tales. Richard dismissed the information, turning his attention back to the expensive specialists. Hours later, as darkness enveloped the city, Richard sat alone in the recliner beside Tyler's bed, scrolling through emails without really seeing them. The hospital corridor outside had grown quiet, visiting hours long over. Only the persistent beeping of the monitors and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on the polished floor broke the silence. Richard's mind wandered to the early days of his career, sleeping on a friend's couch, working 18-hour days, making his first million by 30. 3 divorces and countless broken relationships later, he had amassed a fortune that landed him on magazine covers, but the empire he'd built seemed meaningless now. His reverie was interrupted by a sudden, shrill alarm. Tyler's monitor flashed red as his blood pressure plummeted. Richard jumped to his feet, knocking his phone to the floor. "Help! Someone help!" he shouted, rushing to the door. The emergency response team flooded in within seconds, pushing Richard aside as they worked on his son. A nurse guided him to the hallway, where he watched through the glass, helpless as medical professionals fought to stabilize Tyler. "BP's dropping. Push 1 of epi. Get the crash cart ready." 20 agonizing minutes later, Dr. Montgomery emerged, his scrubs damp with sweat. "We've got him stabilized for now," he said, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. "But honestly, Richard, we're losing this battle." Richard nodded numbly, unable to form words. When the team finally cleared out, leaving just a night nurse to monitor Tyler, he remained in the hallway, sliding down against the wall until he sat on the cold floor. For the first time in years, Richard Wainwright, the man who could buy anything, finally cried. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as the reality he'd been fighting for months finally crashed through his carefully constructed defenses. His son was dying, and all his money, power, and connections couldn't stop it. When he finally looked up, he was startled to see Elijah standing silently a few meters away, holding an amber bottle. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Richard asked, too drained for hostility. "I came to bring this." Elijah extended the bottle. "It's for Tyler." "Get out of here before I call security," Richard responded automatically. Elijah placed the bottle on the bench beside Richard and turned to leave. "My grandmother always said that pride kills more people than any disease. If you change your mind, I'll be cleaning the oncology floor." Richard watched him walk away, the young man's back straight despite the earlier humiliation. For a brief moment, Richard wondered what it would be like to have such conviction, such certainty in something beyond spreadsheets and property values. When he finally returned to Tyler's room, Richard noticed something he hadn't before. A small folded drawing on the table beside the bed. It was a detailed sketch of medicinal plants with precise annotations, simply signed Elijah J. Richard picked it up, studying the meticulous drawings. Despite himself, he was impressed by the precision and detail. These weren't crude doodles, but scientific illustrations that wouldn't look out of place in a botanical textbook. The night. Nurse came in to check Tyler's vitals. "He's been through so much," she said softly, adjusting Tyler's blanket. "How can someone so young endure such suffering?" Richard didn't answer. His eyes moved between his son's pale face and the amber bottle he'd brought in from the hallway. The liquid inside caught the dim light, glowing with an almost hypnotic warmth. "Mr. Wainwright," the nurse said before leaving, "sometimes the most unexpected people have the answers we need. My mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 3 years ago. Western medicine gave her 3 months. A healer from her village in the Philippines gave her herbs that the doctors couldn't explain. She's still with us today. With that, She quietly left the room. Richard sat in the silence, Tyler's breathing the only sound. He thought about the 14 experimental treatments that had cost millions and done nothing but make his son suffer. He thought about the prestigious doctors who had promised results and delivered only elegant explanations for their failures. Then he thought about the look in Elijah's eyes, not the opportunistic gleam of someone seeking money or fame, but the clear, steady gaze of someone who simply knew something. Richard held the amber bottle up against the corridor light, the substance within glowing in amber hues, as his fingers trembled with the impossible choice between his pride and his son's life. Richard's fingers traced the contours of the amber bottle, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like the towering skyscrapers he'd built across Manhattan. As dawn's first light crept through the hospital blinds, he tucked the mysterious vial into his jacket pocket. He'd think about it after getting some rest. Just a few minutes, he told himself, as he settled into the recliner beside Tyler's bed. He wasn't sure how long he'd dozed when a sound jolted him awake. A sound so foreign in this room of beeping machines and labored breathing that it took him a moment to recognize it. Laughter. Tyler's weak but unmistakable laugh. Richard's eyes snapped open to the unimaginable sight before him. Elijah sitting casually beside Tyler's bed, one hand gesturing animatedly as he told a story, the other holding a cup from which Tyler was sipping a dark liquid. Most shocking of all were Tyler's cheeks, slightly flushed with a pink hue Richard hadn't seen in weeks. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard lunged forward, yanking the cup from his son's hands. Dark liquid sloshed over the side, staining the pristine hospital sheets. "Tyler, you can't drink things given to you by strangers." "Dad, I feel better," Tyler protested, with an energy Richard hadn't witnessed in months. His voice, though still weak, carried a spark that had been absent for too long. Elijah said his grandmother— "Nurse!" Richard shouted into the hallway, his voice echoing against the sterile walls. "Someone's given an unauthorized substance to my son." Chaos erupted within seconds. Dr. Montgomery rushed into the room, followed by a flurry of nurses. 2 security guards appeared, firmly grasping Elijah's arms as they escorted him toward the door. "It's just herbs," Elijah called over his shoulder as he was dragged away. "It's helping him. Check his vitals." "I want a complete toxicology panel," Richard demanded, his face contorted with rage and fear. "I want to know exactly what he gave my son. If there's any damage—" "Mr. Wainwright," the charge nurse interrupted, checking Tyler's monitors. "His oxygen saturation is actually up 2 points from last night." "Coincidence," Richard snapped. "Run the tests." Every test. For the next 3 hours, Tyler was subjected to a battery of examinations. Blood was drawn, samples were collected, machines whirred and printed results. Richard paced the hallway outside, making angry calls to his legal team about pressing charges against the hospital for allowing unauthorized personnel access to his son's room. Finally, Dr. Montgomery emerged from the lab, his expression perplexed. "Richard, I need to speak with you. In private." In the corridor, the doctor showed him the test results displayed on a tablet. "Not only did we find no toxins, but Tyler's blood levels have improved by 30% since yesterday. It's unprecedented." "Impossible." Richard shook his head, snatching the tablet to examine the numbers himself. "Must be a lab error." "We ran it 3 times, the doctor insisted, taking back the tablet and scrolling through multiple reports. "And that's not all. His fever is gone, oxygen saturation has stabilized, and he's responding cognitively better than we've seen in weeks." Richard staggered to the nearest chair, collapsing into it as the implications washed over him. "Are you saying that herbal potion actually—" "I'm saying something changed dramatically, and it coincided with whatever Elijah gave him." Dr. Montgomery lowered his voice. "Look, I'm not endorsing unauthorized treatments, but as Tyler's physician, I have to acknowledge the improvement, however it happened." When Richard returned to Tyler's room, He found his son sitting up in bed, actually requesting food for the first time in weeks. Not just accepting whatever was put in front of him, but specifically asking for a cheeseburger. "Dad," Tyler said as a nurse arranged his lunch tray, "I want to see Elijah again. He told me I'd need 3 more doses for it to work completely." Richard sat heavily in the chair beside the bed, watching in astonishment as Tyler took a genuine interest in the hospital's pale approximation of a cheeseburger. "Tyler, we can't just let strangers give you mysterious substances," Richard began, but his argument sounded hollow even to his own ears as he watched color returning to his son's face. Later that afternoon, the hospital's head of security delivered disturbing news. Elijah had been banned from the premises following the incident, labeled an unauthorized risk. Despite, though, Richard's newfound skepticism about the hospital's judgment, he had to admit they were following proper protocol. Yet he couldn't ignore the evidence before his eyes. Tyler was sitting up. Tyler was eating. Tyler had asked about his schoolwork. That evening, Richard did something he never imagined. He instructed his driver to find Elijah Johnson's address. The Bentley looked absurdly out of place as it glided to a stop in front of a modest housing complex on the city's outskirts. Richard adjusted his $3,000 suit and checked the address again. Building D, apartment 3B. He climbed the concrete stairs, passing graffiti and peeling paint, acutely aware of the stares his presence attracted. At 3B, he hesitated before knocking firmly on the door. An elderly woman answered, leaning on a gnarled wooden cane. Her face was deeply lined, with intelligent dark eyes that assessed him without surprise. "Mr. Wainwright," she said simply, "Elijah said you would come." The apartment interior was small but impeccably clean. Family photos lined the walls, and the scent of herbs hung in the air. In the small living room, Richard found Elijah organizing dried herbs, seeds, and roots on a table. "How did you know I would come?" Richard asked, uncomfortable in this unfamiliar territory. "Because you love your son more than your pride," Elijah answered simply, "and that's something I can respect." Elijah's grandmother, Martha Johnson, slowly lowered herself into an armchair. At 82, her movements were deliberate, but her eyes remained sharp and clear. "What my grandson gave your boy was medicine used for generations," she said, her Louisiana accent thick, but her diction precise. "Before hospitals would accept us, we had to heal our own." Richard remained standing, his tall frame awkward in the small room. "How can I trust this? There are no studies, no approvals, nothing that proves—" "Is your son better today?" Martha interrupted. Richard paused. "Yes." "Then you already have. Your proof," she concluded. For the next hour, Martha explained the basis of her remedies. Plants whose properties she had learned from her grandmother, who had learned from hers, knowledge passed down through generations since before her ancestors were forcibly brought to America. Elijah showed Richard his notebooks, detailed drawings of plants alongside chemical compositions he'd researched at the library, attempting to bridge traditional knowledge with modern science. "I'm studying to become a doctor," Elijah explained, "but I won't forget what my grandmother taught me. Both forms of healing have value." By the time Richard left, he carried a fresh vial of Martha's herbal remedy in his pocket, and a profound sense of having crossed some invisible boundary in his understanding of the world. On the drive back to the hospital, Richard's phone rang. Dr. Chen's voice came through the car's speakers, tight with urgency. "Tyler is having a severe reaction," she explained. "We believe it's a rebound effect from the substance he received this morning. His condition is rapidly deteriorating." Richard instructed his driver to break every speed limit. By the time he reached the hospital, he found Tyler's room transformed back into a crisis center, his son paler than ever, doctors debating emergency interventions around his bed. "What's happening?" Richard demanded, pushing his way through the medical team. "Any temporary benefit from that substance has been replaced by a severe adverse reaction, Dr. Montgomery explained, his earlier cautious optimism replaced by professional concern. "We're considering placing him in an induced coma to protect his organs." Richard looked at the vial in his hand, torn between science and desperation. The doctors filed out to consult specialists, leaving him alone with a nurse monitoring Tyler's failing vital signs. In that moment of solitude, Richard made an impulsive decision. He mixed Martha's remedy with water from Tyler's cup and gently lifted his son's head, helping him drink it. "It's okay, Tyler," he whispered. "This will help. I promise." Tyler swallowed weakly, his eyes fluttering open briefly to meet his father's gaze. For a fleeting second, Richard thought he saw recognition there, perhaps even trust. Then Tyler's body went rigid. His back arched off the bed as convulsions seized him. The monitors erupted in shrill alarms as Tyler's oxygen levels plummeted and his heart rate became erratic. Richard froze in horror before lunging for the emergency call button. "Help! Somebody help!" he screamed. Doctors and nurses flooded the room, pushing Richard aside as they fought to stabilize Tyler. A security guard physically removed him from the room as he struggled to stay. "What happened?" Dr. Montgomery shouted over the chaos. "He was fine, and then he just started," the nurse began. "He gave him something." Another staff member interrupted, pointing at the empty cup on the bedside table. From the hallway, Richard watched in horror as his son's body continued to convulse despite the medical team's interventions. A nurse held an oxygen mask over Tyler's face, while another prepared an injection. Dr. Montgomery emerged from the room, his face grim. "What did you give him?" he demanded. Richard, pale as a ghost, handed over the vial with shaking hands. "Remedy from Elijah's grandmother. I thought..." Dr. Chen quickly examined the contents. "We need to know exactly what's in here before we administer any additional medication. There could be fatal interactions." As the medical team continued working frantically on Tyler, Richard slumped against the wall, watching through the glass partition as his impulsive decision possibly ended his son's life. Minutes stretched into eternity as alarms continued to sound and medical staff called out status updates in tense, clipped tones. Against all his wealth, power, and connections, Richard had never felt more helpless. He had taken a desperate gamble with his son's life. And now he might pay the ultimate price for his arrogance. First in dismissing Elijah's help, then in administering the remedy without medical supervision. Minutes later, Tyler continued convulsing. Doctors rushed around him, and Richard stood paralyzed outside the room, screaming inside that he had made a terrible mistake. "What did you give him?" Dr. Montgomery shouted, while the emergency team worked frantically over Tyler's convulsing body. Richard, pale as a ghost, handed over the vial with trembling hands. "Remedy from Elijah's grandmother. I thought..." Dr. Chen quickly examined the amber bottle. "We need to know exactly what's in here before we administering any additional medication. There could be fatal interactions." For 3 agonizing hours, Richard observed from the doorway as doctors fought to stabilize his son. Tyler's convulsions had finally subsided, but he remained unconscious, his vital signs erratic. The hospital director had been called, lawyers alerted. Not only was Tyler's life in danger, but the hospital's reputation and Richard's freedom were at stake. Administering unapproved medication to a patient could result in criminal charges. "Mr. Wainwright," said the hospital director, Dr. Feldman, a stern woman with silver-rimmed glasses, "what you've done constitutes medical interference. The legal ramifications alone..." "Save my son first," Richard interrupted, his voice hollow. "Sue me later." A junior doctor rushed in with preliminary analysis of the herbal mixture. "There are at least 12 compounds we can't immediately identify," he reported. "We're sending samples to the university lab for more comprehensive testing." "And in the meantime?" Richard asked. Dr. Montgomery shook his head. "We're flying blind. We don't know if the convulsions were caused by the herbal remedy itself or by an interaction with his existing medications. Richard slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He'd spent his life controlling every variable, manipulating outcomes, bending reality to his will through the sheer force of wealth and determination. Now, he could only wait. A commotion at the end of the hallway drew his attention. Security guards were blocking an elderly woman with a cane and a familiar young man at her side. "Let them in," Richard ordered, rising to his feet. "They know the remedy." The guards looked to Dr. Feldman, who reluctantly nodded. Martha Johnson made her slow but determined way toward Tyler's room, Elijah at her elbow supporting her. "Mrs. Johnson," Richard said, the formality feeling strange after the intimacy of their meeting in her home. "Tyler is—" "I know," she said simply, moving past him into the room. The medical staff tensed as she approached Tyler's bed, but Dr. Montgomery gestured for them to allow her space. Martha studied Tyler carefully, her weathered hand reaching out to rest lightly on his forehead. She checked his pupils, felt his pulse, and examined the color of his lips. "The remedy is working," she announced calmly, "but it's fighting against years of synthetic medications. The convulsions are part of the process." "How can I believe that?" Richard shouted, desperation cracking his voice. "My son is dying." "No, he is healing," Martha corrected, her hand still resting on Tyler's arm. "The problem is that you gave only half the treatment. You need to complete the cycle." Dr. Montgomery stepped forward. "Mrs. Johnson, no unauthorized substances will be administered in this hospital. We're already facing potential liability for what's happened." "Then you will lose him," Martha replied, without drama or emphasis, simply stating what she believed to be fact. Dr. Feldman had heard enough. "Security, please escort these people out, and be advised that if any further alternative substances are administered to this patient, we will immediately contact the authorities." As security approached, Elijah spoke up. "The convulsions should stop within the next hour, if my grandmother is right. His fever will break by morning. If that happens, will you at least consider that she might know what she's talking about?" Dr. Montgomery exchanged glances with Dr. Chen. "We can wait 1 hour," he conceded. "But no additional treatments unless approved through proper channels." After Martha and Elijah were escorted to the waiting area, the room fell into tense silence, broken only by the beeping of machines. Dr. Feldman returned to her office after making it clear that her legal team would be in touch with Richard regardless of the outcome. 53 minutes later, Tyler's convulsions stopped completely. His breathing deepened and steadied. By morning, as Elijah had predicted, his fever broke. Richard found himself in an impossible situation. Tyler's condition had stabilized but remained critical according to the medical team, who insisted on conventional intensive treatment. Martha and Elijah believed Tyler needed to complete the herbal treatment, or the initial benefits would be lost. "I need some kind of proof," Richard pleaded with Martha when she was permitted a brief visit the following day. "I can't just believe." "The proof is in the eyes," Martha answered. "Look at your son now and compare with pictures from a week ago." Reluctantly, Richard pulled out his phone, scrolling to recent photos of Tyler, a skeletal boy with yellowed skin and deep eye sockets. Even now, after the convulsions, there was a subtle but undeniable difference. His skin had more color. His lips were no longer bluish. That night, in the quiet of Tyler's room, Richard made the most difficult decision of his life. Against medical advice, he would sign Tyler out of the hospital, taking full responsibility. His legal team had already warned him of the consequences: possible loss of custody, negligence charges, even criminal liability if Tyler worsened. "I'm removing my son from this hospital," he announced the following morning, to the shock of the medical staff. "This is madness, Richard," Dr. Montgomery protested. "He needs intensive care, not folk medicine." "You've had 3 years," Richard responded, trembling but resolute. 3 years, millions of dollars, and my son has only gotten worse. I'm trying another path. Dr. Feldman was summoned immediately. Mr. Wainwright, I strongly advise against this course of action. If you remove Tyler from medical care in his condition, we will be obligated to report this to Child Protective Services as medical neglect. Do what you have to do, Richard replied, signing the AMA against medical advice forms with a steady hand. I'll do the same. As he prepared to transport Tyler, arranging for a private ambulance and home medical equipment, his chief counsel called with devastating news. The hospital had obtained an emergency court injunction preventing Tyler's removal, citing imminent risk to life. Guards were stationed at his room door, and Richard was informed that attempting to remove Tyler would result in his arrest. Richard stormed through the hospital corridors, phone pressed to his ear as his legal team scrambled to counter the injunction. He found himself at the hospital chapel, a place he'd never entered before. It was empty, quiet, the stained glass casting colored light across empty pews. He sat heavily, the fight temporarily drained from him. After a moment, he sensed someone enter and sit beside him. I'm sorry, Elijah said quietly. This is my fault. I should have approached differently, explained better. Richard shook his head. No, I should have listened instead of ridiculing you. Pride nearly cost me everything. He looked at the young man directly. I can't lose my son, he admitted, for the first time speaking to Elijah as an equal. What do I do now? Bring science to our side, Elijah suggested. My grandmother never rejected modern medicine. She believes both can work together. For several minutes they sat in silence, an unlikely alliance forming between them. Then Richard pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in years. Arjun, it's Richard Wainwright. I need your help. That night, while Tyler slept restlessly, Richard explained the situation to his old college friend who had built a distinguished career in ethnobotany. Dr. Arjun Patel listened without interruption, asking only clinical questions about Tyler's condition and the observed effects of Martha's remedy. I'll be there tomorrow, Dr. Patel promised, and I'll bring a team. If there's something medicinal in this remedy, we'll find it, document it, and translate it into terms the hospital can accept. When Richard returned to Tyler's room, he found his son awake but groggy. Dad, Tyler whispered, am I still getting better? Richard took his hand, alarmed at how cold it felt. Yes, we're trying something new. The medicine tastes terrible, Tyler said with the faintest smile. But Elijah said his grandmother made it specially for me. You rest now, Richard said, smoothing Tyler's hair. Help is coming. The following morning, Richard was awakened by a gentle shake. Dr. Patel stood over him, travel-worn but alert. Behind him were 3 colleagues carrying specialized equipment. We'll need samples of the remedy, access to Tyler's medical records, and a place to set up, Dr. Patel said without preamble. And we'll need to speak with Elijah and his grandmother. Within hours, a small team of independent scientists had established a makeshift lab in an unused hospital office. The hospital administration had reluctantly approved their presence, mostly due to Dr. Patel's reputation and Richard's legal threats. Meanwhile, Tyler's condition continued to deteriorate. His body, having received only a partial dose of Martha's treatment, seemed at war with itself. The hospital doctors, attempting to counter the effects of the unknown substance, administered a cocktail of medications that left the boy in a semi-comatose state. We need more time, Dr. Patel pleaded, examining samples in the improvised laboratory. We're identifying compounds I've never seen interacting this way. But Tyler didn't have time. His kidneys began failing, and the medical team prepared for emergency dialysis. Richard watched helplessly as the hospital staff wheeled in yet more equipment, this time to take over functions his son's body could no longer perform. The court hearing to contest the injunction was scheduled for the following day, but Richard feared it would come too late. Tyler was slipping away, trapped between two approaches to healing that were working against each other, rather than in harmony. That evening, Richard sat alone with Tyler while the night shift nurses changed. He held his son's limp hand, remembering the day Tyler was born, that rush of love he'd felt, the promises he'd made to always protect him. How hollow those promises felt now. "Not with money," he whispered to his unconscious son. "I tried to solve everything with money, but some things can't be bought." The door opened softly, and Martha entered, moving slowly to Tyler's bedside despite the visiting hours restriction. "The nurses let me come," she explained. "They care about him too." She placed her hand on Tyler's forehead, her expression grave. "He's walking between worlds now," she said quietly. "We don't have much time." "Give me hope," Richard pleaded. "Something real." Martha studied him thoughtfully. "Come with me," she said finally. "There's something you should see." She led him to the small garden behind the hospital, where Elijah was waiting. Under the light of a crescent moon, Martha carefully knelt to examine a patch of unremarkable weeds growing against the building's foundation. "This," she said, pointing to a plant with jagged leaves, "is one of the main ingredients in my remedy. It grows anywhere there is neglect, between concrete, in abandoned lots. People call it a weed and destroy it without knowing its power." She plucked a leaf, crushed it between her fingers, and held it out for Richard to smell. The scent was sharp, almost medicinal. "Knowledge doesn't care about wealth or status," she continued. "It waits for someone humble enough to see value where others see only weeds." As they returned to the hospital, Dr. Patel intercepted them, his eyes wide with excitement. "Richard, we found something incredible," he announced, showing data on his tablet. "The remedy contains a compound that acts directly on Tyler's genetic defect, something we never considered because it doesn't exist in Western medicine." "Richard, we found something incredible," Dr. Patel announced, showing data on his tablet. "The remedy contains a compound that acts directly on Tyler's genetic defect, something we never considered because it doesn't exist in Western medicine." "What does that mean?" Richard asked, grasping at this new thread of hope. "It means she was right all along," Dr. Patel explained, his eyes bright with scientific excitement. "And more importantly, it means we can synthesize and standardize the compound so that the doctors feel safe administering it." Dr. Montgomery, who had been observing skeptically from a few feet away, stepped forward to examine the preliminary data. His brow furrowed as he scrolled through the findings. This is extraordinary if confirmed," he admitted, professional curiosity overcoming his initial resistance. Richard looked from the data to Martha, who stood quietly observing the exchange, her weathered face betraying no surprise. "You knew this all along," he said, not a question but a statement. Martha nodded slightly. "Knowledge doesn't need validation to be true, Mr. Wainwright. It just is." The next 12 hours became a desperate race against time. While Dr. Patel's team worked to isolate and purify the active compound, Tyler's organs continued failing. His liver function tests showed alarming results, and his breathing grew more labored despite oxygen support. The court injunction remained in effect, preventing any unauthorized treatment. Hospital administration had stationed a compliance officer outside Tyler's door to ensure no unapproved substances were administered. The legal team representing the hospital had made it clear. Breaking the injunction would mean immediate arrest and potential criminal charges against Richard, Martha, and anyone else involved. Dr. Patel and his colleagues worked through the night, analyzing the molecular structure of the compounds in Martha's remedy. When morning came, the ethnobotanist looked exhausted, but determined as he presented his findings to the medical team. The primary compound appears to directly inhibit the erroneous protein Tyler's body produces due to his genetic mutation, he explained, pointing to complex molecular diagrams. It's structurally unlike anything in our pharmacopoeia, but the mechanism makes perfect sense when you understand it. Dr. Chen studied the data with growing interest. If this is accurate, it could revolutionize treatment for this entire class of disorders. But we cannot administer an unproven remedy, Dr. Feldman insisted. The legal and ethical implications alone. My son is dying while we debate ethics, Richard interrupted, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. How much proof do you need? The tension in the room was broken when Martha, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood and approached Tyler's bed. We don't need to give the medicine directly, she explained, her voice calm and measured. Some herbs can be absorbed through the skin. The doctors exchanged glances, recognition dawning on their faces. Transdermal administration, Dr. Montgomery said slowly. That wouldn't technically violate the court order against oral administration. It's a gray area at best, Dr. Feldman warned, but perhaps a reasonable compromise until the court hearing. With reluctant approval from the medical team, they initiated a treatment of compresses soaked in Martha's herbal remedy. The nurses were instructed to apply the compresses to Tyler's chest and back, technically circumventing the prohibition on oral administration. It was a precarious compromise. The doctors continued their protocols while Martha's treatment was applied externally. Richard watched as Martha taught the nurses exactly how to prepare the compresses, the precise temperature of the water, how long to let the herbs steep. Her confident movements spoke of decades of practice, a knowledge as precise in its way as any medical procedure. Will this be enough? Richard asked her privately. If he can't drink it? The medicine finds its way, Martha replied. The skin knows how to drink what it needs. Throughout that day and into the night, the medical team continued monitoring Tyler's condition, expecting little change. Richard remained at his son's bedside, alternating between making urgent calls to his legal team and simply holding his son's hand. Tyler remained unconscious, his young face pale against the white hospital linens. On the third morning, something remarkable happened. As the early sun filtered through the hospital blinds, Tyler opened his eyes and asked for food. Dad? His voice was weak but clear. Can I have pancakes? Richard, who had been dozing in the chair beside the bed, jolted awake. Tyler, you're awake. The boy's vital signs, monitored hourly, showed consistent improvement that left the medical team perplexed. Dr. Montgomery reviewed the latest results repeatedly, shaking his head in disbelief. It's impossible, he murmured, checking the blood work results again. His inflammation markers have dropped 80% in 72 hours. His kidney function is normalizing. Even his blood cell morphology is improving. Dr. Chen examined Tyler herself, testing his cognitive responses and muscle strength. Tyler, can you squeeze my hand? Good. Can you tell me what day it is? Thursday, Tyler answered correctly. Hospital pancakes aren't as good as IHOP, but I'm really hungry. By the afternoon, Tyler was sitting up in bed, conversing with Elijah about video games. The young man had been permitted to visit after Dr. Patel vouched for his scientific understanding of the treatment process. Tyler's color had improved dramatically, and the dark circles under his eyes had lightened. The compound appears to be working exactly as we hypothesized, Dr. Patel explained to the assembled medical team in a hastily organized conference room meeting. It's binding to the misfolded proteins and facilitating their breakdown and elimination from Tyler's system. But this defies everything we know about this condition, one specialist objected. The protein accumulation was considered irreversible. Perhaps it's time to reconsider what we know, Dr. Chen suggested quietly. The story quickly transformed from scandal to medical miracle. Dr. Patel's preliminary paper on the compound discovered in Martha's remedy attracted international attention. The court injunction was lifted after the hospital withdrew its objection, acknowledging the clear improvement in Tyler's condition. Reporters who had previously criticized Richard's irresponsibility now clamored for interviews about the revolutionary discovery. Richard found himself in the unfamiliar position of turning down media appearances rather than seeking them. His focus remained entirely on Tyler, whose improvement continued steadily, day by day. By the end of the week, the boy was walking the hospital corridors with assistance, his body slowly remembering its strength. "Your remedy saved my son," Richard said to Martha one evening as they watched Tyler sleeping peacefully. "I don't know how to thank you." "You thank me by remembering that wisdom comes in many forms," Martha replied, "and by helping Elijah achieve his dream of becoming a doctor who understands both worlds." 2 months later, on the odd day of Tyler's discharge, Richard arranged a gathering in the hospital auditorium. Present were the medical team, the scientists, Martha, Elijah, and, of course, Tyler, now with color in his cheeks and renewed energy. "I've learned the most important lesson of my life," Richard began, visibly emotional as he addressed the assembled group. "That wisdom doesn't only come from expensive degrees or cutting-edge laboratories, but also from traditions passed down through generations. My pride and prejudice nearly cost my son's life." Richard announced the creation of the Wainwright Johnson Foundation, dedicated to researching the integration of traditional and modern medicine, with Martha as honorary consultant and a full scholarship guaranteed for Elijah at any university of his choice. "This isn't charity," Richard clarified, looking at Elijah. "It's investment in a future where medicine doesn't distinguish between knowledge sources, only between what helps patients and what doesn't." Dr. Montgomery, who had been one of the most skeptical initially, stepped forward. "As physicians, we're trained to trust evidence. The evidence of Tyler's recovery is undeniable, and it challenges us to expand our definition of what constitutes valid medical knowledge." After the ceremony, as people mingled and congratulated Tyler on his recovery, Dr. Patel approached Richard with a concerned expression. "We've hit a snag with the research," he said quietly. "A pharmaceutical company is claiming proprietary rights to synthesize compounds similar to those in Martha's remedy. They're trying to patent what they're calling the active ingredient before we can complete our studies." "Which company?" Richard asked, his jaw tightening. "BioNexus," Dr. Patel replied. "They've already filed preliminary patents based on our published findings." Richard watched as Tyler laughed with Elijah, the two of them examining Martha's handwritten notes on a new plant she'd brought to show the boy. The sight of his son, healthy and engaged, filled him with a protective determination that extended beyond Tyler to the knowledge that had saved him. "They can't patent something that's been used for generations," Richard said. "Can they?" "Unfortunately, they're not trying to patent Martha's remedy," Dr. Patel explained. "They're isolating specific molecules, making slight modifications, and patenting those as new compounds. Legally, it's defensible." As the celebration continued around them, Richard realized that saving Tyler's life had been only the first battle. Now, a new fight was beginning, one that would determine whether this healing knowledge would benefit humanity or be locked behind patents and profit margins. While Richard contemplated the transformation of his life, Dr. Patel burst into his office with alarming news. BioNexus is filing a lawsuit to stop Martha from using her own knowledge, claiming patent infringement. They want to make illegal what she's doing to help these people. Hospital director Dr. Feldman studied the laboratory report on the compresses, her face transforming from confusion to indignation. She slapped the papers down on her desk and adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses. "This is a clear violation of hospital protocol," she declared, looking around the room. "These compresses contain the exact substance we were legally prohibited from administering." The tense meeting in the administrative conference room had assembled quickly. Hospital lawyers, Richard, Dr. Montgomery, and 2 board members all sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "With all due respect," Richard countered, his suit rumpled after 3 days of barely leaving the hospital, "those compresses saved my son's life when your approved protocols were killing him." The lead hospital attorney cleared his throat. "The issue isn't whether the treatment worked, Mr. Wainwright. It's that the court order specifically prohibited administration of unapproved substances, regardless of method." "You're hiding behind legalities while ignoring medical reality," Richard snapped. Dr. Patel, who had been invited to join midway through the meeting, intervened with the calm authority of scientific expertise. "What we're witnessing here is a compound that Western medical science was completely unaware of. The molecular structure interacts with the misfolded proteins in Tyler's blood in a way that none of our existing medications can achieve." He projected complex molecular diagrams onto the wall screen, pointing to specific structures. "This isn't some random herbal concoction. This is sophisticated biochemistry that happens to have been discovered outside the traditional pharmaceutical development pathway." The hospital board members leaned forward, their interest piqued, despite their official stance. One of them, Dr. Singh, adjusted her glasses as she studied the projections. "If this data holds up to peer review," she murmured, "we could be looking at an entirely new class of therapeutics." Meanwhile, in Tyler's hospital room, a remarkable scene was unfolding. The 12-year-old sat propped up against pillows, his skin showing healthy color, a gaming controller in his hands. Beside him, Elijah sat in a visitor's chair, his own controller in hand, as they navigated a virtual landscape together. 3 doctors stood by the door, clipboards in hand, observing with poorly disguised amazement. "No way!" Tyler exclaimed as Elijah's character executed a complex maneuver. "You have to teach me that combo." Elijah grinned. "Practice, man. Took me forever to get it right." Dr. Chen made notes on Tyler's chart, shaking her head slightly. "Cognitive function normal. Energy level consistent with healthy 12-year-old. Reaction time standard." She looked at her colleagues. 2 weeks ago, he couldn't lift his head from the pillow." Outside the hospital, Martha Johnson politely but firmly declined the barrage of questions from journalists who had gathered at the entrance. "The knowledge isn't mine to sell," she told them, leaning on her cane. "I learned from my grandmother, who learned from hers. I'm just one link in a very long chain." "But your remedy cured the Wainwright boy when modern medicine failed," a reporter pressed. "Don't you want recognition?" Martha's gaze was steady. "Recognition doesn't interest me. Healing does." As evening approached, Richard stood by the window in Tyler's room, watching his son and Elijah engaged in animated conversation. The connection between them was genuine and deep, transcending the circumstances of their meeting. Tyler laughed at something Elijah said, a real laugh, from the belly, not the weak approximation Richard had grown accustomed to during the long illness. "He really likes Elijah," Martha observed, coming to stand beside Richard. "He's never had many friends," Richard admitted. "Always sick, always different." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Elijah understands being different, being seen as less than what you are." Later, when Tyler had fallen asleep and Elijah had gone to help his grandmother home, Richard found himself walking with Martha in the small hospital garden. The night air was cool, and Martha tightened her shawl around her shoulders. "I want to understand something," Richard said quietly. "All this knowledge you have, how was it preserved? How did it survive?" Martha sat on a bench, arranging her skirt as she considered the question. "During slavery, our ancestors had nothing but the knowledge in their heads. No books they were allowed to read or write, no property they could claim. Knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken away." She closed her eyes, remembering. "My great-grandmother was taken from her village in West Africa when she was just 14. She was a healer's apprentice there. In America, she kept that knowledge alive, added to it with plants she found in this new land." Richard saw it suddenly. A young woman in chains, memorizing plants, remembering treatments, passing that wisdom along in whispers and demonstrations under cover of night. During the day, she worked the fields, Martha continued. At night, she healed. Both slave and free, black and sometimes white when they were desperate enough. She taught her daughter, who taught her daughter, and so on, until it came to me. And you taught Elijah, Richard said. He has a gift, Martha smiled. A mind for both worlds, the old knowledge and the new science. He sees connections others miss. A commotion at the hospital entrance drew their attention. A group of university professors had arrived, demanding to speak with the hospital administration about documenting the Tyler Wainwright phenomenon. Among them were pharmaceutical representatives, thinly disguising their interest as academic curiosity. The following morning, Richard found Elijah in the hospital cafeteria, hunched over a textbook, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd been up most of the night studying. "You look exhausted," Richard commented, sitting across from him with a coffee. Elijah closed his book with a sigh. "All these people suddenly want to talk to me, interview me. Some professor offered me a research position before I've even finished undergraduate work." He rubbed his eyes. "I never wanted fame, just wanted to help." "Why did you help Tyler?" Richard asked, the question that had been nagging at him for weeks. "That first day, when you came into his room, why risk your position at the hospital to help a stranger?" "I saw his blood work on the monitor," Elijah admitted. The pattern of cell deformation looked exactly like something my grandmother had described treating years ago. It wasn't about who he was. It was about recognizing something I knew how to help. Later that day, Richard intercepted a group of pharmaceutical researchers attempting to pressure Martha into revealing all her formulas. He found them in a small conference room, Martha sitting stiffly while two men in expensive suits leaned over her, one with a recording device prominently placed on the table. "This meeting is over," Richard announced from the doorway. "Mr. Wainwright," one of the men smiled thinly. "We were just discussing potential collaboration with Mrs. Johnson. BioNexus Pharmaceuticals is prepared to offer very generous compensation for her knowledge." "Did you explain that once you have her knowledge, you'll patent it and she'll be legally forbidden from using it herself?" Richard asked coldly. "Or that the communities who've relied on these remedies for generations will suddenly find themselves priced out of accessing their own heritage?" The men exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. "We're talking about standardizing traditional remedies for wider benefit," the second man argued, "bringing them into compliance with FDA regulations." "You're talking about exploitation," Richard countered, "and this meeting is still over." After they left, Martha looked at Richard with a mixture of amusement and gratitude. From skeptic to defender in 2 weeks. That might be a record. That evening, Tyler was sitting up in bed when Elijah visited, bringing a small potted plant as a gift. "It's lemon balm," Elijah explained. "Good for calming the mind. You can make tea from the leaves when you're having trouble sleeping." Tyler accepted the plant with surprising reverence. "Why did you want to help me?" he asked suddenly. "Even after my dad was so mean to you?" Elijah considered the question carefully. "Because my grandmother taught me that knowledge that heals should never be withheld, no matter who asks for it." "But my dad was awful to you," Tyler pressed. "He was scared," Elijah shrugged. "Fear makes people do unkind things, but that doesn't change what's right." Tyler nodded thoughtfully, running his fingers over the aromatic leaves. "I want to learn about plants like you know. Will you teach me?" "Of course," Elijah smiled. "We'll start with this. 1. That night, long after visiting hours had ended, Richard and Martha sat in the quiet hospital garden. The moon was high, casting silver light over the carefully maintained flower beds. "There's something I've been wondering," Richard said. "Why did you keep this knowledge hidden for so long? Something this valuable." "We didn't keep it hidden," Martha answered softly. "You just never wanted to listen." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal with yellowed pages, covered in detailed notes about plants, formulas, and cures. The complete history of knowledge rejected by the world that now desperately wanted it. Richard sat in his hotel room near the hospital, a single lamp casting a warm glow over Martha's ancient journal. The late hour meant nothing to him as he turned each fragile page with careful fingers, absorbing stories spanning generations. The leather-bound book was worn smooth by countless hands, its pages yellowed with age, filled with precise handwriting in different inks that mapped the evolution of a healing tradition. "My dearest daughter," he read from an entry dated 1842, "today I have recorded the properties of the fever root that saved Master's youngest child. Though they thanked the doctor who arrived too late, it was our knowledge that preserved the boy's life. Remember this plant by its star-shaped leaves and the sweet smell of its roots. It grows in the shadows of oak trees, hidden from those who do not seek with humble eyes." Richard paused, struck by the parallel to Tyler's situation. As he continued reading, the journal revealed a meticulous record of plants, their properties, harvesting methods, and preparation techniques. But beyond the botanical knowledge, he found himself immersed in the secret history of a family forced to hide its wisdom while freely giving its healing. One passage from 1863 made him sit back in his chair, stunned. The entry described Martha's great-grandmother attempting to save a white child, suffering from the same rare blood disorder as Tyler. The ink was blotched in places, as though tears had fallen while writing. "They called me witch and charlatan when I offered to help the Cartwright boy. His blood fails him just as it failed my own son, whom I could not save in time. The doctor drove me away with threats of hanging, though I only wished to spare another mother my grief. The boy died 3 days later. I record this remedy here so that perhaps someday another child might be saved when pride no longer blinds those with power." Richard checked the formula described. It matched almost exactly what Martha had given Tyler. "My God," he whispered to the empty room. "They knew. They've known for over a century." The gravity of this realization kept him reading until dawn broke. When he finally closed the journal, Richard understood that he held not just a medical text, but a testament to human resilience. Knowledge preserved against impossible odds. Wisdom passed secretly through generations of women who healed despite being denied education, recognition, or safety. When Richard entered Tyler's hospital room that morning, he found his son sitting alone by the window, gazing thoughtfully at the city below. It was the first time Tyler had been able to sit unassisted for an extended period since his admission months ago. "Hey, buddy," Richard said softly. "What are you thinking about?" Tyler turned, a new brightness in his eyes. "About Elijah and his family. He told me stories yesterday while you were in meetings." "What kind of stories?" Richard asked, pulling a chair beside his son. "About his great-great-grandmother, who could make pain go away with just her hands and plants. About how they had to pretend they weren't healers because people would get angry." Tyler's expression became serious. "They were like secret superheroes, Dad, helping people who wouldn't even look them in the eye during daylight." Richard's throat tightened. That's a good way to put it." "Why didn't anyone listen to them before?" Tyler asked, the innocent directness of childhood cutting to the heart of the matter. Before Richard could formulate an answer, Dr. Patel burst into the room, his normally calm demeanor disrupted by obvious agitation. "Richard, we have a problem. BioNexus is attempting to patent the primary compound from Martha's formula." "They can't do that," Richard responded automatically. "It's indigenous knowledge, traditional medicine." "They claim they've refined it," Dr. Patel explained, showing Richard documents on his tablet. "They're filing patents on a synthesized version with minor molecular modifications. Legally, they might succeed." Richard scanned the documents, his jaw clenching tighter with each paragraph. Who gave them access to our research data? That's the other problem. It appears someone at the hospital has been sharing information. The molecular structures in their patent application are identical to our preliminary findings. A video conference was hastily arranged in Dr. Montgomery's office. On the screen, 3 executives from BioNexus Pharmaceuticals sat in an elegant boardroom, their expressions professionally pleasant. Mr. Wainwright, began the CEO, Sarah Latimer, I understand your concern, but I assure you our interest is in making this breakthrough accessible to patients worldwide through proper clinical trials and regulatory approval. At what price point? Richard challenged. And with what recognition to the traditional knowledge holders? Latimer's smile didn't waver. We're prepared to acknowledge the inspiration from traditional sources in our documentation. As for pricing, we have shareholders to consider, but of course, we have patient assistance programs for those who qualify. This compound has been used for over a century by Martha Johnson's family, Richard countered. You're attempting to monopolize knowledge that was freely shared to save my son. With all due respect, Mr. Wainwright, what Mrs. Johnson provided was a crude herbal mixture. What we're patenting is a precisely isolated, purified, and slightly modified molecule that can meet FDA standards. That's how medicine advances. After the tense call ended, Richard confronted Dr. Feldman about the hospital's apparent collaboration with the pharmaceutical company. The hospital has research partnerships with several pharmaceutical developers, Dr. Feldman admitted without apology. Information sharing is part of those agreements. Not when it involves misappropriating traditional knowledge, Richard argued. Dr. Feldman's expression hardened. Mr. Wainwright, 6 months ago you wouldn't have given 2 seconds thought to traditional knowledge. Now suddenly you're its champion? The accusation stung because it contained truth. Richard had no response. Later that afternoon, Martha visited Tyler, bringing a small terracotta pot containing a vibrant green plant with distinctive serrated leaves. This is the main plant in your medicine, she explained, placing it on his bedside table. I want you to learn to recognize it, to know it by sight and smell and touch. Tyler reached out to gently stroke a leaf. What's it called? It has many names, Martha replied. Scientific people call it Scutellaria lateriflora. My grandmother called it blue skullcap. Her grandmother had another name from Africa that's been lost to us now. Will it keep growing if I take care of it? Tyler asked. That's the wonderful thing about knowledge and plants, Martha smiled. With proper care, they both keep growing long after we're gone. When the crew from National Health arrived to interview Tyler about his miraculous recovery, Richard expected to need to coach his son on what to say. Instead, Tyler handled the questions with surprising poise for a 12-year-old. The doctors tried really hard, Tyler explained to the reporter, but Elijah and his grandmother knew the answer all along. They just needed someone to listen. Out of the camera's frame, Richard watched with a mixture of pride and humility. Something profound had shifted in Tyler during his illness and recovery. A wisdom beyond his years now shone in his eyes. That evening, Richard consulted with his legal team about protecting the Johnson family's knowledge. The conference call with his top intellectual property lawyers left him frustrated. The problem is that traditional knowledge doesn't fit neatly into existing IP frameworks, explained his lead attorney. BioNexus has resources to fight this for years, and courts tend to favor documented, patentable innovations over historical cultural practices. After the call, Richard found Elijah in the hospital cafeteria, both of them seeking a late dinner after a long day. How are you holding up? Richard asked, setting down his tray across from the young man. Tired, Elijah admitted. But good tired, you know, like we're doing something that matters. Richard nodded, then asked the question that had been bothering him all day. Why aren't you furious with the world for ignoring this knowledge for so long? With people like me who dismissed it, with companies trying to steal it now? Elijah considered the question while stirring his soup. My grandmother says knowledge is like water. It always finds a way, no matter how many barriers people put up. He shrugged. Being angry doesn't help the water flow. Removing obstacles does. Richard thought about this as he returned to his hotel room. On his laptop, he began drafting an email to his company's board of directors. The executive committee had been running Wainwright Properties in his absence, with increasing impatience for his return. Instead of the reassurances they sought, Richard found himself writing something entirely different. A plan was forming, not just for Tyler's continued recovery, but for a complete redirection of Richard's considerable resources. If the medical establishment wouldn't protect this knowledge properly, perhaps it was time to create an institution that would. At midnight, Richard initiated a video call with his board of directors. Their faces appeared on screen, ranging from concerned to irritated at the late hour. I appreciate you all joining on short notice, Richard began. I'm proposing something unexpected, but I believe essential. I want to create a foundation for preserving and studying traditional medicine, and I want to do it now. Richard, said Victor Collins, his CFO, while we all sympathize with your personal situation, redirecting company resources toward an unrelated field of— Not company resources, Richard interrupted. My resources, my controlling shares, my personal fortune. The board members exchanged glances. You're talking about a significant distraction from our core business, another director cautioned. I'm talking about saving lives, Richard countered, including my son's. This isn't a distraction. It's my new purpose. As Richard continued outlining his vision for the Wainwright Johnson Foundation, his phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced down briefly, then froze at the notification on his screen. A breaking news alert showing Martha being aggressively approached by reporters outside her apartment building, with the headline, "Exclusive, we've found the healing witch who saved the billionaire's son." Richard's Bentley screeched to a halt outside Martha and Elijah's apartment building. The scene was chaos. Reporters swarming the entrance, camera flashes illuminating the night, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Through the mob, Richard could see Martha's small figure at the center, Elijah attempting to shield her as they tried to reach their apartment door. Get the car as close as possible, Richard instructed his driver, then stepped out into the fray. Mr. Wainwright, is it true this woman cured your son with voodoo? Richard, over here! Did you pay her for the miracle cure? Is BioNexus developing the witch's potion for mass market? The questions pelted him like hail as he pushed through the crowd, security personnel from his hotel flanking him as they carved a path. When he reached Martha and Elijah, the elderly woman's face was stoic, but her hand trembled slightly on her cane. Mrs. Johnson, Elijah, Richard said formally, aware of the recording devices surrounding them. I've come to bring you to safer accommodations. Elijah's relief was visible. Thank you, sir. With practiced efficiency, Richard's security team created a protective barrier, escorting Martha and Elijah to the waiting Bentley. As the car pulled away, Martha gazed back at the building through the window. They treated us as invisible until yesterday, she observed quietly. Now they won't let us be invisible even to sleep. The drive to Richard's estate in the city's outskirts took 30 minutes. As they passed through ornate gates and up a winding driveway, Elijah whistled softly at the sprawling mansion that emerged, its windows glowing warmly against the night sky. It's just temporary, Richard explained, suddenly self-conscious of his wealth in a way he'd never been before. Until we can arrange something more permanent, or the media loses interest. Inside, the contrast between Martha's humble possessions, hastily packed in 2 worn suitcases, and Richard's opulent surroundings couldn't have been more stark. Crystal chandeliers hung above marble floors, original artwork adorned walls. A staff member appeared silently to take their bags. The East Wing has been prepared, the housekeeper informed Richard. Mrs. Johnson's room connects to her grandson's through a shared sitting room, as requested. Martha ran her hand over a mahogany side table, a small smile playing at her lips. In my whole life, I never expected to be a guest in such a place. The following morning brought another milestone. Tyler was coming home. After months in the hospital, his discharge papers had been signed, his continuing care arranged. Richard waited anxiously as the private ambulance pulled up to the mansion's front entrance. When Tyler stepped out, assisted by a nurse but walking under his own power, Richard fought back tears. His son looked around with wide eyes, as though seeing the family home for the first time. "It looks different," Tyler commented as they entered the grand foyer. "Everything's the same as when you left," Richard assured him. Tyler shook his head. "No, I'm seeing it different." Richard understood then. It wasn't the house that had changed, but Tyler himself. Months of facing mortality had transformed his perception. The material trappings that Richard had accumulated meant little compared to the simple gift of being alive, of breathing without pain. Tyler spent that afternoon exploring his bedroom like it was a new place, touching his possessions with a sense of rediscovery. When he found his gaming console untouched since his hospitalization, he smiled but set it aside, more interested in watching Martha inspect the mansion's gardens from his window. "She says this place has good soil," Elijah explained, joining Tyler at the window. "Perfect for growing her medicinal plants." Later, Richard found Martha in the estate's extensive gardens, evaluating the southern exposure beds with a critical eye. "This area would be perfect for the fever root," she noted. "Good drainage, right amount of shade." "Plant whatever you need," Richard offered. "The gardeners will assist you." Martha nodded, already plotting a healing garden in her mind. "Your son is stronger today. His blood is remembering its proper shape." That evening, Richard faced another battle, a video conference with his company's board of directors, who had moved from concern to outright hostility regarding his prolonged absence and new priorities. A foundation for traditional medicine? The disbelief in board chairman Victor Collins's voice was palpable through the screen. "You've lost your mind, Richard." "My son was dying," Richard responded calmly. "Now he's not. That changes a man's perspective." "No one's disputing your personal gratitude," another board member interjected, "but redirecting company resources toward folk remedies and—" "Not folk remedies," Richard corrected firmly. "Traditional medicine with demonstrable efficacy that predates our pharmaceutical industry by centuries." "Shareholders are getting nervous, Richard," Collins warned. "There's already talk of removing you as CEO if this distraction continues." "Then let them vote," Richard replied, ending the call. He sat back in his leather chair, the weight of potential consequences settling on him. Wainwright Properties had been his life's work, a multi-billion-dollar empire he'd built from nothing. Now he was risking it all for a cause he wouldn't have given a second thought to 3 months ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. Meanwhile, Elijah had discovered Richard's extensive library, a 2-story room lined with books Richard had collected but rarely read. The young man moved through the shelves reverently, pulling volumes on biochemistry, pharmacology, and botanical medicine. "This collection is amazing," Elijah told Richard when he found him there later. "You have first editions of botanical texts I've only read about." Richard gestured to the books. "Use whatever helps your studies." Elijah selected a volume on molecular biology. "I've been trying to understand exactly how my grandmother's remedies work at the cellular level. If I can document the mechanism scientifically, maybe I can bridge both worlds." The following morning brought an unexpected development. A family appeared at the mansion's gates, a security guard escorting them to the front door. Richard found them in the entrance hall, a couple in their 30s with a pale, thin girl of about 9 in a wheelchair. "Mr. Wainwright," the father began uncertainly, "we're sorry to intrude. We heard about the miracle with your son." The mother stepped forward. "Our daughter Emma has the same condition. The doctors gave up 6 months ago. Please, if there's any chance." Richard looked at the child, her face bearing the same hallmarks of the disease that had nearly claimed Tyler: the papery skin, the shadowed eyes, the struggling posture. His instinct was to protect Martha and Elijah from the potential complications of treating another child without medical authorization. But Martha had already appeared in the hallway, drawn by the voices. She approached the wheelchair without hesitation. "Hello, little one," she said softly, kneeling despite her age to meet the girl's eyes. "You've been carrying a heavy burden, haven't you?" As Martha gently examined the child, asking quiet questions about her symptoms, Richard watched with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he wanted to help this family experiencing the same desperation he had known. On the other, he worried about the legal ramifications, for Martha, for himself, and for his growing vision of legitimizing this healing tradition. Later that day, Dr. Patel arrived at the mansion with troubling news. BioNexus has succeeded in patenting a synthetic version of the primary compound, he explained, spreading documents across Richard's desk. They're moving with remarkable speed. Richard scanned the papers, his concern deepening. Can they prevent us from using the natural version? That's the gray area, Dr. Patel replied. Their patent covers specific synthetic processes, but they're already suggesting that any similar compound, even naturally derived, could constitute infringement. While the adults grappled with legal and ethical quandaries, Tyler and Elijah had begun creating a small healing garden in a sheltered corner of the grounds. Tyler knelt in the dirt, his formerly frail hands now steady enough to transplant seedlings under Elijah's guidance. "This is the one that saved me?" Tyler asked, carefully, placing a small plant with distinctive leaves into prepared soil. "One of them," Elijah confirmed. "The formula has 5 main plants working together. My grandmother says healing is about harmony. Rarely does one plant work alone." By evening, the situation had grown more complex. Emma's family had been offered a guest house on the property, while Martha prepared a modified version of Tyler's treatment. News of their presence had somehow leaked, and 3 more families with sick children had arrived at the gates, pleading for help. Richard called an impromptu meeting in the mansion's living room, gathering Martha, Elijah, Dr. Patel, and his legal team. "We need a strategy," Richard began. "People are coming because they're desperate, just as I was. But we can't just dispense treatments without proper protocols. These remedies aren't standardized pharmaceuticals," one lawyer cautioned. "Without FDA approval, we're in legally treacherous territory." Martha, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "In my community, I've treated people for 60 years without government papers saying I could. The only approval I needed was the healing I witnessed." "The world's different now, grandmother," Elijah said gently. "We need to protect this knowledge legally so it can help more people." As they debated approaches, Martha suddenly revealed something unexpected. What saved Tyler wasn't just one plant, but the combination of 5 elements. The balance matters more than any single ingredient. "That could actually help our legal position," Richard's patent attorney noted. "Combinations are more defensible against single compound patents." Richard stood by the window, watching the sunset paint his extensive grounds in gold. The empire he had built seemed to be transforming before his eyes, from stone and steel to knowledge and healing. His priorities had shifted so fundamentally that he barely recognized his former self. "We can't just protect this knowledge," he said, turning back to the group. "We need to ensure it's respected and available to those who need it." That night, long after everyone had retired, Richard found himself unable to sleep. Wandering the grounds, he discovered Martha alone in the garden, planting by moonlight, her hands working the soil with practiced familiarity. Without turning, she sensed his presence. "They will come in greater numbers tomorrow, sick people seeking hope, and we need to decide now, will we hide or will we change the system that rejected us for generations? Dawn broke over Richard's mansion, revealing a scene that stopped him mid-sip of his morning coffee. Still in his robe, he stared out the bedroom window at what had been an empty circular driveway yesterday. Now it was filled with cars, vans, and even a small bus. Beyond the vehicles, a line of people stretched toward the security gate, some holding children, others in wheelchairs, all with the unmistakable look of desperate hope in their eyes. "My God," Richard muttered. "There must be more than 50 people out there." A soft knock on his door preceded Martha's entrance. Despite the early hour, she was fully dressed, her gray hair neatly pinned back. "They started arriving at sunrise," she said matter-of-factly. "Word spreads quickly among the desperate." "This is..." Richard gestured helplessly toward the window. We can't help everyone," Martha finished for him. "But we can help some, and we can do it wisely." Within the hour, Richard had convened an emergency meeting in the kitchen. Elijah, Martha, the house staff, and 2 security personnel gathered around the massive island counter, faces serious as they grappled with the situation unfolding outside. "We have 2 immediate problems," Richard began. "First, we have no system for evaluating who needs help most urgently. Second, we have no legal protection for what we're doing here." Elijah, who had been quietly studying a notebook filled with his grandmother's formulas, looked up. "We need a triage system," he suggested. "Medical intake forms, documentation of symptoms, proper follow-up procedures. We can't just distribute remedies without tracking outcomes." "That sounds like practicing medicine without a license," one of Richard's security team cautioned. "Then we need licensed medical professionals involved," Richard decided. "Let me make some calls." As Richard stepped away to use his phone, Elijah and Martha began drafting a basic intake process. Meanwhile, the crowd outside continued to grow, news vans now joining the assemblage. Within 2 hours, Richard had transformed his spacious garden into an impromptu consultation area. Patio tables were arranged in stations, with Martha's herbs and preparations organized methodically on a central table. Security maintained order, allowing small groups in at a time while explaining to others that they would need to wait. The real surprise came mid-morning when Dr. Montgomery arrived unannounced, medical bag in hand. "I came as a doctor, not as an opponent," he explained, when Richard met him at the gate with obvious suspicion. "I want to understand." Richard studied the man who had treated Tyler for years, who had initially dismissed Martha's remedy. "What changed your mind?" "Tyler's blood work," Dr. Montgomery admitted. "In 30 years of practice, I've never seen a reversal like that. Whatever my professional skepticism, I can't ignore results." With Dr. Montgomery's arrival, a tentative collaboration began. Martha explained the properties of different plants, while the doctor contributed his knowledge of conventional treatments and potential interactions. They set up a station where he could perform basic examinations before patients saw Martha. Tyler, despite Richard's initial protests that he should rest, insisted on helping. He moved among the waiting families, especially the children, telling his own story in simple terms. "I was really sick too," Richard overheard him, telling a young boy attached to a portable oxygen tank. "The medicine tastes gross, but it works. You'll be running around soon." The boy's mother wiped away tears as Tyler continued chatting, demonstrating his regained strength by performing jumping jacks. By early afternoon, a news crew from the local affiliate had arrived, cameras and microphones at the ready. Richard intercepted them at the property line. "No cameras," he said firmly. "These are sick people seeking help, not a spectacle for your ratings." "The public has a right to know what's happening here," the reporter countered. "Is it true you're operating an unlicensed clinic?" "We're helping people with traditional remedies under medical supervision," Richard replied carefully. "That's all I'll say for now." As the reporter pressed for more, a commotion at the gate announced another arrival. Dr. Feldman from the hospital strode purposefully toward Richard, his face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous, Wainwright," he shouted, gesturing toward the garden. "You're practicing medicine without a license. I'm reporting this to the medical board immediately." Richard stepped forward, positioning himself between Dr. Feldman and the anxious families watching the confrontation. These people have been abandoned by the medical establishment. They've tried your treatments. They've mortgaged homes for medications that didn't work. Now they've found hope. "Hope isn't a treatment plan," Dr. Feldman retorted. "These are vulnerable people you're exploiting with unproven remedies." "Unproven?" Richard's voice rose, surprising even himself with its intensity. "My son was dying under your proven care. Now he's alive and thriving because of Martha's knowledge." The two men stood toe-to-toe, the wealthy developer and the medical director, representing two worlds in collision. Richard felt a strange reversal, defending Martha with the same ferocity he had once directed against Elijah's intervention. "You can't stop this," Richard said more quietly. "Too many people need help. Work with us or against us, but we're not stopping." As Dr. Feldman stormed off, promising legal consequences, Elijah approached Dr. Montgomery with his notebook. Inside, Richard could see Elijah had created a hybrid documentation system, combining his grandmother's traditional terminology with scientific notation, chemical compounds, molecular structures, and physiological effects all meticulously recorded. "This is remarkable work," Dr. Montgomery admitted, paging through the notes. "You've essentially created a translation guide between two medical languages." Meanwhile, Martha had just finished consulting with a mother whose son suffered from severe autoimmune issues similar to Tyler's. The boy, who had arrived lethargic and pale, was now sitting up on the examination table, color already returning to his cheeks after his first dose. "Thank you," the mother whispered, tears streaming down her face as she grasped Martha's hands. "We've seen 20 specialists. None of them gave us what you just did. Hope with results." By late afternoon, they had seen 37 patients, created treatment plans for 29, and turned away 8, whose conditions were either too different from what Martha had experienced treating or too acute to manage outside a hospital setting. As the day wound down, Richard's phone rang, the CEO of Wainwright Properties calling for an update on when he might return to work. "The board is getting restless, Richard," the man explained. "There's talk of a vote on your temporary replacement becoming permanent. You need to make a decision." Richard watched as Tyler helped a young girl with a similar blood disorder walk from one garden station to another, his hand supportively under her elbow, his face alight with purpose. "I understand," Richard replied. "Tell them I'll have an answer by tomorrow." That evening, after the last visitors had gone and the staff was cleaning up, Richard sat with Tyler on the garden bench. The boy looked tired but satisfied, a healthy flush to his cheeks that still seemed miraculous. "I saw you helping today," Richard said. "You were good with those kids." Tyler nodded. "They're scared like I was. Sometimes doctors use big words that make everything scarier. I just told them what it felt like to get better." Richard hesitated, then asked the question weighing on him. "Tyler, would you mind if we weren't so rich anymore? If I left the company to follow a different path?" Tyler looked genuinely confused. "Why would I mind?" "Because it would change our life. This house, the vacations, your private school." "Dad," Tyler interrupted, his expression suddenly much older than his 12 years. "I almost died. Do you think I care about stuff?" Richard felt something shift inside him, the final piece of his old self falling away. His son, in his simple wisdom, had cut through every material concern to the heart of what mattered. Later that night, Richard stood in his office looking at the photos on his desk, his corporate headshot in front of the Wainwright Tower, breaking ground on luxury developments, shaking hands with mayors and governors, a life built on acquisition and expansion. None of the photos showed him with Tyler. He was about to turn away when his phone buzzed. A text from his chief counsel, Legal team has reviewed the situation. Significant exposure if you continue current activities. Recommend immediate cessation of all treatments pending proper licensing. As Richard considered his response, he heard voices from the garden below his window. Elijah and Dr. Montgomery were still working, comparing notes under outdoor lighting. Their earlier professional divide dissolved in shared purpose. If we combine the traditional preparation methods with standardized dosing, Elijah was saying, we might satisfy both approaches. Richard made his decision. The next morning he received another call, this time from his CEO's assistant. Mr. Wainwright, your Interino CEO is considering your permanent removal, Richard. While Richard contemplated the complete transformation of his life, Dr. Patel burst into the office with alarming news. BioNexus is filing a lawsuit to stop Martha from using her own knowledge, claiming patent infringement. They want to make illegal what she's doing to help these people. Richard stood in the foyer of his mansion, staring at the legal document that had just been delivered. His face drained of color as he read the terms of BioNexus's lawsuit. The pharmaceutical giant wasn't just targeting the foundation he planned to establish, they were directly suing Martha Johnson for patent infringement, claiming she had no right to use her own family's remedies. This is insane, he whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he turned to the second page. The injunction sought to immediately prohibit Martha from preparing, distributing, or administering any compounds containing derivatives of the patented molecular structures. In essence, they were trying to make it illegal for Martha to use the knowledge her family had preserved for generations. Richard quickly assembled an emergency meeting in the mansion's library. Around the massive oak table sat Martha, Elijah, and a team of elite attorneys Richard had summoned from his corporate legal department. The wood-paneled room, normally a haven of quiet reflection, now hummed with tension. They're claiming Mrs. Johnson's remedy infringes on their patent because they isolated and slightly modified one molecule from her formula, explained James Harrington, Richard's chief counsel. They've fast-tracked the patent application using emergency protocols, claiming public health significance. But how can they patent something that's been used for over a century? Richard demanded. It's like trying to patent bread. This is the gray area of intellectual property law, another attorney explained. They're not patenting the plants themselves, but specific chemical structures derived from them. With slight modifications, those become novel inventions under current law. Elijah, who had been furiously taking notes, looked up with determination. We need to research historical documentation of these remedies. If we can prove prior use and public knowledge, we might be able to invalidate their patent claims. Martha sat quietly in her chair, appearing smaller somehow against the grand backdrop of Richard's library. She watched the discussion with calm eyes that belied the gravity of the situation. I've seen this before, she finally said, silencing the room. When I was a girl, a company came and took plants from our community. They made medicines and got rich. We got nothing. Not money, not credit, not even the right to keep using what we'd always known. She shook her head slowly. History repeats when no one remembers. Over the next several hours, Richard's team developed a legal strategy. They would challenge the patent's validity based on prior art, the documented historical use of these remedies. Simultaneously, they would file a countersuit claiming cultural appropriation and exploitation of indigenous knowledge. Meanwhile, Elijah had settled at one of the library computers, diving deep into research on precedents involving traditional knowledge and patent law. There's something here, he called out after nearly 3 hours of searching. A case from 2015 involving an Amazonian plant compound. The indigenous community successfully argued that their traditional knowledge constituted prior art that invalidated a pharmaceutical patent. The attorneys crowded around his screen, making notes and discussing implications. As they debated legal strategies, Richard noticed Martha wasn't among them. He found her in the small greenhouse he had hastily constructed for her medicinal plants, meticulously tending to seedlings. "I'm sorry about this," he said, joining her among the green shoots. "I never imagined they would go after you personally." Martha continued her work, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision. "When people fear losing power, they become dangerous. These companies see our knowledge as a threat now, not just a curiosity." "We'll fight them," Richard promised. "I have resources they can't imagine." Martha looked up at him with a knowing smile. "Money against money is just noise, Richard. What we need is truth against lies." Back in the library, the legal team had developed a preliminary response to the lawsuit, but Richard wasn't satisfied. The approach felt too conventional, too corporate, exactly what BioNexus would expect. "We need to think differently," he insisted. "This isn't just about legal arguments. It's about the story we tell. People need to understand what's really at stake here." That evening, Richard used his media connections to arrange interviews with carefully selected journalists, not the sensationalist reporters who had hounded Martha outside her apartment, but thoughtful writers known for their integrity. The narrative needed to shift from Billionaire's miracle cure to corporate theft of cultural heritage. While Richard orchestrated the media strategy, Elijah continued his research, now joined by Dr. Patel. Together, they worked to document every aspect of Martha's remedies, not just their efficacy, but their historical lineage and cultural significance. "We need to create an unbreakable chain of evidence," Dr. Patel explained, "from your family's earliest use of these plants to today." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, an unusually swift timeline that suggested BioNexus had influential connections within the court system. Richard's attorneys advised caution, warning that the judge assigned to the case was known for favoring corporate interests. As the days passed, a community began to form around Martha and her work. The families who had been helped volunteered their time, sharing their stories and assisting with the growing number of people seeking treatment. Dr. Montgomery had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to help develop a protocol that would satisfy both traditional methods and medical standards. Yet amid this growing support, Richard noticed that Martha was becoming increasingly fatigued. She still rose early each morning to tend her plants and meet with patients, but her movements had slowed, and she often paused to catch her breath. "You need to rest," he told her one afternoon, finding her looking unusually pale after a consultation. "There's too much work," she replied, leaning heavily on her cane. "Too many people needing help." Despite her protests, Richard insisted that Martha reduce her schedule, arranging for Elijah to handle more of the consultations under her guidance. But during a particularly busy afternoon, Martha suddenly grew faint while explaining a treatment protocol to a mother with a sick child. "I just need to sit for a moment," she insisted, reaching for the edge of a table to steady herself. Elijah was at her side instantly, helping her to a chair. Dr. Montgomery, seeing the commotion, came over to check her vital signs. "Your grandmother needs medical attention," he told Elijah quietly. "Her pulse is irregular, and her blood pressure is concerning." Despite Martha's protests, Richard insisted on a full medical examination. The results confirmed their fears. Martha's heart was showing signs of strain, and her kidneys weren't functioning properly. "She's been pushing herself too hard," Dr. Montgomery explained to Richard and Elijah in the privacy of Richard's study. "At her age, this level of stress and activity is dangerous." That evening, Richard found Elijah in the greenhouse, continuing his grandmother's work of tending the medicinal plants. The young man looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "She won't stop," Elijah said without looking up. "Even when I beg her, she says, 'There's too much knowledge that hasn't been passed on yet.'" Richard placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Then we need to make sure that knowledge is preserved, with or without the lawsuit." Together, they developed a systematic approach to documenting everything Martha knew. Richard brought in professional videographers to record Martha explaining her remedies. Elijah worked with botanical illustrators to create detailed drawings of each plant. Dr. Patel arranged for chemical analysis of the remedies to create a bridge between traditional descriptions and scientific terminology. Martha, though weakened, threw herself into this preservation effort with remarkable energy, often working late into the night, dictating ancient recipes to Elijah, determined to ensure nothing would be lost. "My grandmother made me memorize everything," she explained to Richard. She said, "They can take your books, your home, even your freedom, but they can't take what's in your mind if you hold it sacred." As the court date approached, Richard's legal team discovered a potentially transformative legal precedent involving traditional Amazonian plant knowledge that had successfully challenged a similar pharmaceutical patent. The case had established that generational knowledge held by indigenous communities constituted prior public use that invalidated subsequent patent claims. "This could change everything," the lead attorney explained, spreading the case documents across Richard's desk. "The judge can't ignore this precedent without exposing himself to appeal." On the eve of the preliminary hearing, Richard reviewed their strategy one final time with the legal team. They had assembled a compelling case, historical documentation, expert testimony, and powerful human stories from those Martha had helped. "We're as ready as we can be," James concluded, "but corporate patent cases are unpredictable. BioNexus has tremendous resources and influence." Richard nodded, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. Not just for Tyler's continuing recovery, but for Martha's legacy and the countless others who might benefit from this knowledge in the future. After the lawyers departed, Richard made a final check on Martha, who had been unusually quiet during dinner. He found her room empty and, concerned, began searching the house. He eventually discovered her in the garden, feverishly writing in her journal under the soft glow of patio lights. "You should be resting," he said gently. Martha looked up, her face etched with fatigue but her eyes bright with purpose. "I need to finish this section on heart remedies. There are variations I haven't explained to Elijah yet." "It can wait until tomorrow," Richard insisted. Martha shook her head stubbornly. "Knowledge doesn't wait, Richard. It flows when it's ready." She returned to her writing, her hand trembling slightly as she made careful notations. Richard stood watching her for a moment, struck by her determination. This woman who had been invisible to society for most of her life was now fighting to preserve a legacy that might change medicine forever. The following morning, as Richard prepared to leave for court, word came that Martha had collapsed while making breakfast. By the time he reached her, paramedics were already loading her into an ambulance. "Suspected heart attack," one of them told Richard quietly. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately." In the emergency room, while doctors worked to stabilize Martha, she gripped Richard's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me that you won't let this knowledge die again, even if I'm not here to see the victory," she whispered. And Richard realized that this battle had now transcended any legal question. It had become his mission in life. Richard sat beside Martha's hospital bed, holding her frail hand in his. The steady beep of monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to his whispered promise. "I won't let this knowledge die. Martha, I'll make sure it lives on." Her eyes fluttered open briefly, recognition flickering across her face before she drifted back to sleep. The doctors had managed to stabilize her condition, but warned that her heart had suffered significant damage. At 82, recovery would be challenging. Elijah stood on the other side of the bed, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. "The hearing starts in an hour," he reminded Richard. "I'll stay with her." Richard nodded, reluctantly releasing Martha's hand. He straightened his tie. Not the power tie he would have chosen for a corporate battle in his previous life, but a simple blue one Tyler had given him last Father's Day. "Call me immediately if anything changes," he instructed, then hesitated at the doorway. "Your grandmother is the bravest person I've ever known." Elijah's smile was small but genuine. She says the same about you. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers when Richard arrived. The case had captured public attention, a David versus Goliath battle over who owned ancient healing knowledge. BioNexus had spun the narrative as protecting scientific innovation, while Richard's team had positioned it as corporate theft of cultural heritage. Inside the packed courtroom, Richard took his seat beside his legal team. Across the aisle, BioNexus's representatives sat in perfect formation, their expensive suits and confident postures projecting inevitability. Judge Eleanor Hewitt entered, her stern expression revealing nothing as she surveyed the crowded room. This is a preliminary hearing on BioNexus Pharmaceuticals versus Martha Johnson et al., she announced. I understand there's a motion for immediate injunctive relief. BioNexus's lead attorney rose smoothly. Yes, Your Honor. We're seeking to prevent the defendants from continuing to infringe on our clients' patented molecular compounds through unauthorized production and distribution. When it was his turn to speak, Richard surprised everyone by standing instead of deferring to his attorneys. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to testify personally. After a moment's consideration, Judge Hewitt nodded. Richard was sworn in, and for the next 20 minutes, he shared Tyler's complete story. The years of failed treatments, the chance meeting with Elijah, and the remarkable recovery that followed Martha's intervention. 3 months ago, Richard concluded, I would have been the last person to defend traditional medicine. I believed in the system, pharmaceutical solutions, clinical trials, patents. But that system failed my son, while knowledge preserved by Mrs. Johnson's family for generations saved him. This isn't about infringement. It's about recognizing that wisdom belongs to humanity, not corporations. The BioNexus attorney rose for cross-examination. Mr. Wainwright, isn't it true that you stand to profit considerably from this so-called traditional knowledge through your planned foundation? The foundation will research and document traditional remedies, making them available to anyone who needs them, Richard replied. That's the opposite of BioNexus's approach, which seeks to monopolize and restrict access. Next, Elijah approached the witness stand, carrying Martha's weathered journal. He carefully presented it to the judge. This journal belonged to my great-great-grandmother, he explained. It documents the exact formula BioNexus is claiming to have invented in their lab. The entry is dated 1863, more than 150 years before their patent application. Judge Hewitt examined the journal, her expression thoughtful as she studied the yellowed pages with their careful illustrations and handwritten notes. Dr. Patel testified next, presenting his analysis of Martha's remedies. The sophistication of these formulations is remarkable, he explained, displaying molecular diagrams on the courtroom monitor. Far from being primitive folk medicine, these represent a complex understanding of biochemical interactions that we're only beginning to comprehend with our modern technology. The BioNexus attorneys objected repeatedly, arguing that historical documentation didn't invalidate their patent on synthesized compounds. However, their argument seemed increasingly hollow as the evidence mounted. During a brief recess, Richard checked his phone and found a text from Tyler. We're all watching the live stream. You're doing great, Dad. Martha would be proud. As the court reconvened, Richard noticed something unexpected. The courtroom had quietly filled with families, parents with children in wheelchairs, elderly people with oxygen tanks, young adults bearing the visible signs of chronic illness. They sat in silent support, their presence a powerful testament to what was truly at stake. BioNexus's final argument centered on economics and innovation. If companies cannot protect their investments in research and development, pharmaceutical advancement will stagnate, their attorney argued. This case threatens the entire foundation of medical progress. Richard's lead attorney countered, What threatens medical progress is the suppression of valuable knowledge, because it doesn't fit our conventional paradigm. Martha Johnson's family preserved healing wisdom that our medical establishment ignored for centuries. Now that it's proven valuable, they want to claim ownership. That's not innovation, it's appropriation. As the arguments concluded, Judge Hewitt announced she would deliberate before ruling on the injunction. The court adjourned, and Richard stepped outside to call the hospital for an update on Martha. "She's asking about the hearing," Elijah told him. "Her condition is stable, but she's worried about the outcome." "Tell her to focus on getting stronger," Richard replied. "We've presented our case as well as we could." While the jury deliberated, Richard received a call that made his heart leap. Martha had regained consciousness and was asking to speak with him. He rushed to the hospital, where he found her sitting up slightly, still connected to monitors but alert. "The verdict?" she asked immediately, her voice weak but insistent. "Still deliberating," Richard told her, taking her hand. "But you should have seen the courtroom, Martha. So many people came to support us." A small smile curved her lips. "Knowledge finds its defenders when it's time." The call came 3 hours later. The jury had reached a decision. Richard raced back to the courthouse, where the crowd had grown even larger. Inside, the tension was palpable as Judge Hewitt took her seat. "In the matter of BioNexus Pharmaceuticals versus Martha Johnson et al., she began, "this court finds that the plaintiff's patent claims are invalidated by prior art, as documented in the Johnson family records. Furthermore, the court recognizes that traditional knowledge maintained by communities through generations constitutes protected cultural heritage that cannot be appropriated through minor modifications." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by muffled cheers from the supporters in the back rows. "The motion for injunctive relief is denied," Judge Hewitt continued. "Additionally, the court recommends that the Patent Office review its protocols regarding traditional knowledge to prevent similar appropriation in the future." The BioNexus attorneys immediately huddled, discussing appeal options, but Richard barely noticed. He was already calling Elijah with the news. 2 weeks later, a very different gathering took place on the grounds of what had once been Richard's private estate. Construction crews were finishing the conversion of the mansion into the headquarters of the Wainwright Johnson Foundation. A stage had been set up on the main lawn, and a large crowd had assembled for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Martha, in a wheelchair, but dressed in her finest clothes, sat at the center of the stage. Beside her, Elijah stood tall in a new suit, his face beaming with pride. Tyler, now healthy and energetic, fidgeted excitedly in his chair. Richard approached the podium, surveying the assembled crowd. Medical professionals, patients, journalists, and curious community members. "When my son was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder 12 years ago, I believed that my wealth and influence would save him," Richard began. "I was wrong. What saved Tyler wasn't money or power, but knowledge. Knowledge that had been preserved through generations, despite being ignored and dismissed by the very institutions I trusted." He gestured to Martha. "The Wainwright Johnson Foundation represents a new approach, one that honors traditional wisdom while embracing scientific verification. Not to replace modern medicine, but to complement it. Not to hoard knowledge, but to share it." Martha, despite her weakened condition, insisted on cutting the ribbon herself. As she snipped the ceremonial band, declaring the foundation officially open, the crowd erupted in applause. In the weeks that followed, the foundation quickly established itself as a pioneering institution. The expansive gardens, once merely decorative, had been transformed into a living pharmacy of medicinal plants. Medical students from leading universities came to study under Martha's guidance, while researchers documented traditional remedies from communities around the world. Tyler and Elijah had become inseparable friends, often seen giving tours of the medicinal garden to visiting children with chronic illnesses. Tyler had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the plants, explaining their properties with the enthusiasm only a 12-year-old could muster. Richard had resigned from Wainwright Properties, turning his attention entirely to the foundation. His former board members had been shocked, but as news of the foundation's work spread, many had quietly become supporters. On the foundation's first anniversary, a small ceremony honored Martha with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Though still recovering, she had regained enough strength to supervise the educational programs from her wheelchair. Her knowledge, once passed only to family members out of necessity, was now being methodically documented and shared with medical practitioners from around the world. After the ceremony, a reporter approached Richard. "Mr. Wainwright, do you regret laughing at Elijah that first day in the hospital?" Richard glanced across the garden, where Tyler and Elijah were teaching a group of children how to identify medicinal plants. His son was healthy, vibrant, and filled with purpose. A transformation more valuable than any business deal he'd ever closed. He smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "They say laughter is the best medicine," he answered thoughtfully, "but I discovered that listening is far more effective."